In the foothills of Alberta, concrete towers still stand in the trees, the remains of a machine built to feed Canada's steam railways. This is Nordeg, the Brazeau Collieries, a modern coal operation engineered to turn coal dust into dense briquettes for locomotives. And the coal was not gone. The plant, the mine, the railway spur, and the company town had been built around one product that made sense only while steam engines needed feeding. Then the customer at the end of the line began changing its engines. Canadian National Railway. Through the late 1940s and 1950s, steam gave way to diesel, and Nordeg's strongest customer needed less of the fuel this town existed to make. So the question is not, why did the coal run out? It is, if the coal was still in the mountain, what exactly disappeared? What disappeared was demand, and behind it, a chain of dependence. Nordeg worked because several pieces locked together: a town in the foothills, a mine in the mountain, a briquette plant beside the tracks, and a railway customer that still burned coal by the trainload. The houses needed the mine needed the plant needed Canadian National Railway's steam engines, so the trail does not stop at the mine, it runs down the tracks. Not a secret plot, not a single villain, not even one dramatic event, though one is coming. The evidence points to something colder. One community, one product, one dominant buyer, and one technology already beginning to change. When people describe Nordeg's end as sudden, that is true in the human sense. A closure notice can overturn paychecks, schoolrooms, stores, and kitchen tables almost at once. But the technology shift behind it was not a lightning strike. Dieselization moved through Canadian railways over years, from the late 1940s into the 1950s, shrinking the world Nordeg had been designed to serve. To see why that was so devastating, we have to go back to the beginning, because Nordeg was planned. That plan begins in 1911 with a name stamped onto the documents, Martin Nordeg. Backed by German capital, Nordeg and the Brazeau Collieries set out to build something permanent in the eastern slopes of the Rockies, a mine, a railway connection, and a town that could hold a workforce in a place still hard to reach. On a map, the location looks almost idyllic. On a balance sheet, it was a logistical problem. The mountains promised coal, but also distance, from big cities, ports, easy supplies, and the ordinary life workers and families would need if they were going to stay. So Nordeg became a company town, not a cluster of shacks near a mine mouth. Streets were laid out, houses were built, stores, schools, social spaces, and the everyday architecture of a lasting community followed. The company was not only extracting coal, it was building the human machinery required to keep extraction going. That is why the ruins read differently now. The quiet roads and encroaching forest are not the remains of a careless boomtown. They are the outline of an industrial organism. Homes tied to wages tied to the mine tied to the railway, and the railway tied to a market far beyond these foothills. In Nordeg, remoteness made the system tighter. Every piece had to connect, because if one piece failed, there was nowhere else for the town to lean. The most important connection ran downhill toward the industrial plant, where ordinary coal became the product that made Nordeg valuable. At the industrial plant, the story narrows. Nordeg was not just a coal town. It was a factory system built around steam railways. Coal came out of the mountain in different sizes and grades. Big lumps could be useful on their own, but mining also produced fine coal, slack, and dust, material harder to handle, harder to ship cleanly, and less convenient for a locomotive firebox if left loose. Nordeg's answer was the briquette plant. Coal dust was gathered, processed, mixed with a binder, historically asphalt binder, and pressed into solid fuel blocks. The result was a denser, more uniform product that could be loaded, transported, and burned in steam locomotive boilers. That detail matters because it changes what Nordeg was really selling. The company was not simply digging black rock from a hillside and hoping someone wanted it. It was taking a messy byproduct of mining and rebuilding it into standardized railway fuel. The plant became the hinge between the underground world and the outside market. Miners brought coal out of the seams. Conveyors, crushers, screens, and presses turned part of that coal stream into briquettes. Rail cars carried those blocks away toward the engines that consumed them. When you look at the ruins now, the concrete frames, industrial openings, and broken geometry of the processing site, you are looking at the economic heart of the town. The houses, stores, schoolrooms, and social life up the road all depended on this chain staying alive. Mine to plant, plant to briquette, briquette to steam locomotive. That is the first warning sign. Nordeg's strength was a specialized product for a specialized customer. The system worked beautifully as long as steam engines kept asking for exactly what this plant made. That customer was not an abstract market beyond the mountains. For Nordeg, the crucial demand ran along Canadian National Railway lines. The railway made the town possible. It gave a remote foothills mine a way to reach the outside world, and it gave CNR a steady source of fuel shaped for steam locomotives. On a map, that relationship looks powerful. A mountain coal operation plugged into a national transportation system. But the same map also shows the danger. The line out was also the line Nordeg depended on. The town fed the mine fed the briquette plant. The plant fed railway engines. The railway's orders fed the pay envelopes that kept Nordeg alive. This is the risk a company town can hide in plain sight. The dependency runs into kitchens, schoolrooms, store counters, church halls, and houses lined along company streets. A decision made far away about fuel purchasing, locomotive fleets, maintenance costs, or where the railway spent money next could return as fewer shifts, smaller payrolls, and families wondering whether to stay. None of this required a conspiracy. CNR needed steam fuel, Nordeg was built to supply it, and while demand held, the whole place could look permanent. The briquette plant was producing something useful to a particular technology, inside a particular buyer's system. The concrete, crushers, presses, and rail sidings were a bet that steam would keep needing blocks of rebuilt coal. For years, that bet made sense. Steam locomotives still moved freight and passengers across long distances, burning coal in enormous quantities, and standardized fuel had real value. Nordeg's isolation was manageable because the railway connected it to demand. But the same rail connection that carried Nordeg's product out also carried its vulnerability back in. If CNR changed what its locomotives burned, Nordeg could not simply sell the same briquette to another world at the same scale. By the end of the 1940s, that danger was no longer theoretical. Across North American railroading, diesel locomotives were changing the economics of motive power. Steam did not vanish overnight, but the direction was visible. Then, in 1950, before that market danger fully played out, a fire hit Nordeg in a way that can make the whole story look deceptively simple. On June 14, 1950, fire tore through Nordeg's briquette plant. The building that turned coal dust into railway fuel, the machinery that made the business model work, was destroyed. Production stopped. For a town built around a mine, a plant, and a railway customer, this cut through the entire operating chain. This is the tempting explanation. Burned plant, later ruins, a straight line from fire to abandonment. But Brazeau Collieries did not walk away after the fire. It rebuilt. The new plant cost more than $1.5 million, an enormous investment for a remote coal operation in the early 1950s. By late 1951, Nordeg's briquette machinery was back in operation, rebuilt in concrete and steel, ready to produce the fuel blocks that had made the town valuable. That rebuild breaks the easy explanation. If the fire alone had killed Nordeg, the story would end in 1950, with smoke, wreckage, and silence. Instead, the company put the machine back together. What it could not rebuild was the old certainty that Canadian National would keep needing that machine's product. The plant reopened into a world already changing around it, not because the coal had vanished, and not because one blaze had settled everything, but because the customer at the far end of the rail line was beginning to move on. The rebuild is revealing for one reason. Nordegg restored the plant, but it could not restore the age of steam. By the time the new concrete and steel briquette plant came back online, Canadian railways were entering the diesel era. This was not a single switch thrown overnight. It moved through the late 1940s and the 1950s, locomotive by locomotive, route by route, budget by budget. But for a town built around steam fuel, the direction mattered more than the exact speed. A steam locomotive needed coal. It needed coaling towers, ash pits, water stops, firemen, maintenance crews, and a fuel network stretched across the railway. Nordegg fit that world perfectly. Its briquettes were compact fuel blocks made from coal dust and binder, shipped out because engines down the line could burn them. Diesel changed the calculation. It did not need coal piled beside the track. It did not need ash cleaned from fireboxes. It used a different fuel, moved through a different supply chain, with different maintenance priorities and purchasing decisions. For Canadian National, dieselization promised fewer stops, lower servicing demands, and a modernized railway system. For Nordegg, that modernization cut straight through the town's dependency chain. The company had just spent more than $1.5 million rebuilding a machine designed to feed steam locomotives. The new plant was modern, expensive, and physically stronger than the one the fire destroyed. It was modern, for the wrong future. Every diesel locomotive added to the railway made the old fuel system less central. Every mile converted away from steam weakened the reason for shipping briquettes out of this valley. The coal was still in the mountains. The town still had houses, streets, and institutions. The plant could still make its product. What was disappearing was the buyer's need for it. The fatal blow looked colder than another explosion or a mine running empty. Fewer orders, a railway modernization plan moving forward, and a rebuilt industrial town waiting for demand that no longer made sense. By January 1955, that mismatch reached the date that mattered most to the people living there. That date was January 1955, when the mine closed permanently. For the company, it ended an industrial calculation. For the town, it exposed the weakness built into Nordegg's design. A company town is not just a workplace with houses nearby. The job is the reason the houses are there. The railway is the reason the store has customers. The mine payroll is what keeps the school, church, hospital, hockey rink, and daily routines connected. When the orders stopped, the town's logic came apart. Miners could not stay in a mountain town without mining work. Families who had built their lives around the colliery had to look outward, toward other mines, other railways, other towns where a wage still existed. The population fell sharply, not because the valley had become unlivable, and not because the coal had vanished, but because the economic reason for remaining had been removed. That is the quieter damage of industrial obsolescence. It does not always arrive as a blast. Sometimes it arrives as a final shift never posted, a rail spur carrying less traffic, a schoolroom with fewer children, a row of company houses waiting for families who will not return. Nordegg had been planned as a complete community, but its completeness depended on one chain: coal from the mountain, briquettes from the plant, steam demand from the railway. Once that chain broke at the far end, the town had no second economy large enough to hold it in place. What remains today is not simply abandoned space. Parts of the site are preserved and historically recognized, because these buildings explain a national industrial story. But the old shafts, unstable structures, and closed mine areas are dangerous remnants of that story, not invitations to enter them. The silence around Nordegg is part of the evidence. The streets, rail beds disappearing into forest, and concrete walls of the briquette plant point back to the same failure. A modern town built with no real protection against the loss of its one essential customer. And that brings us back to the ruin we started with. Back at the ruin, the answer is visible in the concrete. Nordegg was not a town that failed to plan. It planned intensely. Housing, roads, schools, rail spurs, mine works, and a briquette plant were arranged around one industrial promise: turn mountain coal into a fuel the railway would keep buying. For a while, that made the place look secure. The town fed the mine fed the plant fed Canadian National steam locomotives. The railway's orders fed everything else. Then the last link changed. As diesel locomotives spread through the railway system, the market Nordegg had been built to serve began to disappear. The coal was not gone. The machinery had been rebuilt. The town had not suddenly become badly designed. Its product was tied to a shrinking world. That is why these concrete walls still matter. They are not just the remains of a fire, a ghost town backdrop, or a failed dream in the foothills. They are grave markers of a dead technology. Nordegg shows how modern infrastructure can become obsolete when it depends on one customer, one product, and one future that does not arrive. Not the end of coal, the end of demand. And in places like this, that can be enough to leave an empire to rust.